Why hello there everyone, while we wait for the next Gundam Evolution playtest, I wanted to make a video discussing the top 15 mobile suits that should be added into Gundam Evolution as playable mobile suits, because of course, with the game launching free-to-play, you know they are going to add more playable mobile suits into the game, and with a franchise as big as Gundam, there is plenty to draw from. And keep in mind, when I say top 15 mobile suits that should be added into the game, I'm not making a list of my 15 favorite mobile suits. What I'm actually doing is I'm considering the popularity of suits, and I'm also balancing that consideration with the feasibility of making a moveset to be used in a video game, such as Gundam Evolution, in this case. In other words, as much as I would love to have half the cast of G Gundam in this game, I know it's ridiculous, so I won't be suggesting that. At least not until the game has been out a while. Also, another rule I would like to impose in the making of this list is that ranged mobile suits should always comprise the majority of the game's roster. So, melee-focused suits such as the Exia and Barbatos should remain an anomaly and not become the norm. Because when I was initially thinking of mobile suits to put on this list, I ended up making over half the list melee suits because it's so easy and exciting to think of movesets for melee-focused suits. But Gundam Evolution is first and foremost a first-person shooter, so like I said, melee suits such as the Exia and Barbatos should be an anomaly and not represent the majority of the cast. So, with all that said, let's get into this list in no particular order. First up, and in this case, I am mentioning this one first because I think this will be the next one revealed for the game or even the next one to be put into the game, and that is a representative from Gundam Wing, because as of right now, there is no Gundam Wing rep playable in the game, which is a very strange vacancy because Gundam Evolution ended up being pretty popular in the West, unsurprisingly, with it being a first-person shooter, and I know that the majority of the Western Gundam fans started with Gundam Wing, and not only that, but the majority of just anime fans in general who aren't even that familiar with Gundam, whenever I talk to them and the topic of Gundam comes up, they always say something like, oh yeah, I watched Gundam Wing when it aired on Toonami, but I didn't keep up with the franchise after that, so anyways, my point is, a lot of people in the West are only familiar with Gundam through Gundam Wing, so putting a suit from Gundam Wing into the game would be a great way to make a lot of people in the West feel as if they already are invested in the game and they have some kind of hook to get into the game and start playing it. So who that Gundam Wing rep should be? I think the intuitive answer would be the titular Wing Gundam, right? But I actually don't think they'll put the Wing Gundam into the game because I think if they were going to put Wing into the game, or Wing Zero into the game, I think it would have replaced the Asimar. But with the Asimar's inclusion as the premier flight character in the game, I think it's the developers and the publishers' declaration that they don't just want to put memorable and recognizable mobile suits in the game. It's a declaration that they want a good variety in the game as well. So I actually think it's a smart decision that they put the Asimar in the game instead of the Wing Gundam. So, who would that leave to be available as the rep for Gundam Wing? I think it'll be a toss-up between the Heavy Arms or the Death Scythe. The reason I say either the Heavy Arms or the Death Scythe is because despite the Wing Gundam being the main character Gundam in Gundam Wing, the Heavy Arms and the Death Scythe definitely seem to be more popular, and they're also more unique, so they would definitely stick out better in a roster for Gundam Evolution. And I hear a lot of people speculating that the Heavy Arms moveset or the Heavy Arms archetype could be like Bastion from Overwatch. But I actually don't think that would be the case, because if you think about it, Guntank already fulfills the role that Bastion fulfills in Overwatch, so I think the Bastion archetype is already taken care of. So instead of Heavy Arms behaving like Bastion from Overwatch, I think it would be a lot more interesting if Heavy Arms' gimmick, so to speak, would be tracking missiles, and wouldn't that be cool if you could have a chance to shoot the missiles out of the air? So obviously the missiles would have to go fast enough that they're actually threatening, but maybe not so fast that it's impossible to shoot them out of the sky. And obviously, of course, Heavy Arms would have to have a whole bunch of other things to shoot, right? Because Heavy Arms is just a walking ammunitions pile. As for the Death Scythe, though, Death Scythe could be a very interesting melee suit. Like I said, I don't think they should add too many melee suits into the game, so that makes me think Heavy Arms is a little bit more likely. But Death Scythe could still be really cool because the Death Scythe could activate an invisibility cloak. And not only would he be able to use the scythe, obviously, as a melee attack, but he also gets this little, I don't even know what you call it, but he gets this little thing on his arm that he can shoot out that has beam weaponry sticking out the sides as sort of a ranged melee thing, and it can return to him. So he could be sort of a hybrid between melee and ranged, rather than being pure melee such as Barbatos. Next up, I think the game really should add some kind of aquatic mobile suit. Really any of the aquatic mobile suits, because they're all so weird. So that could be the Ak guy, that could be the Zegok, that could be a Gog or a High-Gog, any of them really. But that does run into the problem of them all pretty much being melee focused. So it is for that reason precisely why I think the best aquatic suit candidate is the Zogok of all things. So not only would the Zogok just be a really weird miscellaneous pick that would add variety onto the roster, but the moveset writes itself. And that moveset would entail a disposable rocket launcher, boomerangs, a heat sword, and also this extendo punch it could do. So obviously the extendo punch and the heat sword would be melee, but the disposable rocket launcher could be tied to some kind of cooldown ability, and the boomerangs could also be an ability of some kind. So instead of this being a pure melee suit that most of the aquatic suits would end up being turned into, the Zogok, on the other hand, could be this hybrid between melee and ranged, and I think that would make it pretty fun to play as. Next up, you can't have a game with the Zaku without having the Goof, or the Goof. I used to call it the Goof, but since then I've heard some official things pronounce it as Goof, so I've been saying Goof for now, and I'm going to keep saying Goof until I'm convinced otherwise to start saying Goof again. But anyways, the Goof is just a classic design, and just like the Zogok, the moveset writes itself. So you could base it purely on the moveset that is seen in the original Mobile Suit Gundam, and that would entail these gun fingers, but also it has this whip. And if you watched my video, I think I either mentioned this in the tier list video for Gundam Evolution, or I mentioned this in my general overall impressions. I probably mentioned it in the tier list video. But if you watched it, you will recall that I was suggesting they should have put the Goof in the game instead of the Marasai as the premier hook character, because the Goof has these metal tentacles that it can extend and grab enemy mobile suits with said tentacles. So that would have been such an easy move to add as a hook, right? But lo and behold, they can't just take the Marasai out of the game. So I'm not suggesting that they get rid of the Marasai's hook. What I'm saying is they're going to have to think of a way to make the Goof different from the Marasai hook. So instead of it acting like a regular hook that the Marasai has, instead of it just hitting an enemy and pulling them in, I'm thinking that instead of it pulling them, you could have it just wrap around an enemy and it could stun them or suppress them for a time. And how it would look in the game is like the Methus's healing cord, the healing tether. When it connects to someone, you could just have it shown extending from yourself to the enemy, and it sort of moves as you go around them, and maybe if you break line of sight, it breaks, but while it is attached to the opponent, it can root them in place, or it can suppress them, or something like that, instead of pulling them in. So that way, the Goof still has its metal tentacles, but it is a completely different thing from the Marasai hook. On the other hand, you could also base it on the Goof custom from the 8th MS team, and I think that's probably what they would end up doing, because the Goof really is a star of the show in the 8th MS team, whereas in the original Mobile Suit Gundam, it's kind of this random monster of the week type thing. So in the 8th MS team, the Goof custom has a minigun on its arm, and it also has this heat sword, and I think that would make for a really cool moveset to have the minigun and the heat sword, and also in the 8th MS team, it uses this grapple hook to get around as a mobility type thing. So you could do one or the other. You could make it some kind of combination between the original Mobile Suit Gundam and the 8th MS team, but my bet is that it will eventually get added, and when it does, I think it will be the Goof custom from the 8th MS team. Nextly is a mobile suit whose moveset in the game I am the most proud of thinking up. And I'm going to vouch for this one pretty hard because you know a Gundam wingsuit is going to get added into the game. You know the Goof is eventually going to get added. But this one comes from a series that isn't as popular, hence why I am going to vouch for this one pretty hard, because I think this would be a really cool suit to have in the game. So hear me out on this one. It would be the Gundam X, or more specifically the Gundam X Divider. Why do I think the Gundam X would be a great mobile suit for this game? Firstly, the whole gimmick of the Gundam X could be his ult. And the Gundam X could be the only character in the game with a global ultimate. If you're not familiar with the source material, basically the Gundam X can open up these solar panel things on its back, and it makes an X shape, hence the name Gundam X. And with said solar panels, it can shoot this giant, massive beam. I think it's the second most powerful thing in the Gundam franchise. The first most powerful thing in the Gundam canon is the Moonlight Butterfly attack from the Turn A Gundam, and then after that would be the Gundam X's giant, huge beam. I forgot what it's called. I think it's called the Satellite System or something. Anyways, Like I said, it could be a global ultimate. So imagine being able to spawn, like imagine getting killed in the game, and then as soon as you respawn, if your ult comes up, you're able to just aim where the objective is, or maybe your teammates tell you when to fire if they're looking at the objective, and you just sort of point in that direction and you shoot it, and it goes across the entire map as a global ult. That might sound really ridiculous, right? But if you play other games, other competitive games like League of Legends, for example, there are multiple characters in that game with said global ultimates. So one way you could make it balanced is maybe like the RX-78-2's ultimate. You warn the enemies of the area of effect before the attack actually comes out, so you can give them time to escape. So it would be a good way of forcing opponents off of an objective, and it would just be really cool. And like I said, that's the Gundam X's main thing. But of course, a character in the game can't just be a walking ultimate, and that is why it is a great thing that the Gundam X would actually have a really cool moveset in addition to the ult. So in addition to the ult, the Gundam X gets this, or the Gundam X divider specifically gets this thing called an X divider, and it's basically a shield, but the shield is able to open up in the middle and expose all of these barrels that can shoot out a beam shot. So not only is it a shield, but it can shoot out a row of beam projectiles, and not only that, but it also has a propulsion device on each end, so he's able to hold on to it, and it's able to pull him around, and it kind of looks as if he is water skiing, and he's holding on to the thing that you're supposed to hold on to when you're water skiing. So that would give him a really unique form of movement, especially since he's supposed to be a very, he's probably going to be a backliner, right? Like you stay in the back, and then when your ult is ready, you fire it from a long distance. So you could use that X divider to reposition really easily. And so imagine you have the mobility aspect of the X divider as one ability, but you have your other ability as the option to shoot beams from the X divider. And how cool would it be if you could actually use the beam ability while you are getting pulled with the propellant? So you can choose to just fire the beams raw, or you can choose to fire the beams while you're getting pulled around at faster than normal speed. And so that is probably my favorite idea for a suit to be added into the game. Let me know what you guys think, because I think that's a really great idea. Next is a mobile suit who also comes from another one of the more obscure Gundam series. In fact, this source material has never been adapted into an animation. As of right now, it has remained a manga only. But despite this source material being kind of obscure, the actual mobile suit design itself is actually pretty popular, and that is because the design goes so hard, and it is for that reason it actually ends up making its way into several different Gundam games, and that is the Crossbone Gundam. Obviously, its design is immediately appealing just due to the fact that it is a pirate Gundam, and also its kit is super loaded. So it has a beam cutlass, it has a beam shield, it has a crossbow, it has an anti-beam cloak that it wears, and it also has a grappling hook. And so unlike the Marasai and the theoretical moveset for the Goof that I had explained, the grappling hook for the Crossbone Gundam in this case could instead just purely be used for mobility, kind of like the that robot from Apex Legends. If you play Apex Legends, you probably know who I'm talking about. I don't remember the name, but I'm pretty sure there's a character in Apex Legends that can use a grappling hook for mobility. So the Crossbone Gundam, if they wanted to include the grappling hook, they could use it in that way, instead of it being a hook like the Marasai, or instead of it being a root or a suppression like my theorized Goof moveset. But anyways, my point is that the Crossbone Gundam's kit is so loaded, it would be super easy for a game developer to think of a moveset in Gundam Evolution. In fact, its kit is so loaded, they probably won't even manage to get all of its stuff in the moveset in the game. But regardless, I think everyone would love the Crossbone Gundam, so let me know what you think about that one. Next up is a mobile suit that I'm kind of torn on in terms of whether or not it will actually be added into the game, but my point is more so the archetype rather than the mobile suit itself, and that archetype is a Diva archetype from Overwatch. If they really are just adapting archetypes from Overwatch into Gundam Evolution, with Exia being Genji most notably, then it would be really cool if they added some kind of Diva archetype in the sense of, in terms of having a character that's super strong, but then by one means or another loses that power-up and then is in a weakened state and has to pretty much survive in that weakened state until it is able to get its power-up back. So when I was initially thinking of this archetype, the first thing that came to mind was the Gundam Alex, because of the Gundam Alex's armor. In fact, in Gundam Versus, the Gundam Alex has a gimmick like that, because its armor has its own separate HP, and then when its armor breaks, you lose it, and your moveset changes, and then you basically have to wait and work to get the armor back. But upon further thought, I don't think that Alex is popular enough, nor would its moveset be unique enough. So even though I think Alex would fit this archetype the best, I think in reality, it would be more likely if the Penelope Gundam were to be added, because also in Gundam Versus, the Penelope has its own separate HP for this flight craft system that is attached to it, and then when it gets broken, it loses it and turns into the Odysseus Gundam, because the Penelope is just the Odysseus Gundam with this flight unit attached to it. So then in the Odysseus form, you could be really weak, and you'd have to just run around and survive, and then you would have to somehow wait or earn something to get the fight craft back. So the reason why I said I was torn on this is because the Penelope, if you've seen the design, it is very bulky and unwieldy looking. I don't know if they could really put that mobile suit into a first-person shooter and have it go through doorways and corridors with other characters. So maybe the Penelope is a bit much, but whether it's the Penelope or the Alex, I think something should represent the diva archetype. Also, the Penelope is from Gundam Hathaway, and we still have 2 more Hathaway movies to come out before the trilogy is finished, so it could serve as some good cross-promotion there. But if they don't do the Penelope, let me know in the comments who you think would be a good mobile suit candidate to fulfill said diva archetype. Next up is something from an OVA series, a little CGI animated OVA series called MS Igloo, and if you know anything about MS Igloo, you probably know what I'm going to say, because it is single-handedly the best part of that OVA series, and that is the Hildolfer tank. It's not even a mobile suit, technically. It's a mobile tank. And literally, I just want this to be added so I can play as a tank. But really, if you think about it, it's not that ridiculous, because the Asimar gets a transformational ability in which it can transform into its mobile armor flight mode. So it could be similar to that, but instead of enabling flight, you would still be locked to the ground, but instead of flight, you would be granted a whole bunch of extra speed. And so now that I'm thinking about it, I'm wondering how hard it would be to maneuver around some of these maps in the tank mode, because presumably you would be going pretty fast. But how cool would it be if you could enter tank mode to reposition yourself? And when I say tank mode, I'm not talking about a gun tank. I'm talking about a literal tank, as in like an M1 Abrams kind of tank, a real tank. It has 2 different modes. Obviously, like I said, it can transform into a tank. But the other mode, it's like a mobile suit, but instead of legs, it has the tank treads for legs. So it has like the upper half torso of a mobile suit that's attached onto a tank, and when it transforms, it basically condenses down and lays inside of the tank. So anyways, I think that would be a really fun and a really interesting pick, and it would add a lot of variety to the roster. Although I bet if they're going to add this, it probably won't be one of the first additions, but that would be cool if they add it down the line, along the line somewhere, right? So let me know what you think about that. Next up is a personal favorite, but that is not why I am saying it should be added into the game. So before I say what it is, let me do a little preface here. So if you've been watching my videos, you'll know that I think it's very strange there are no beam sabers in the game, especially because the RX-78-2, the Turn A Gundam, and the regular GM should all come outfitted with beam sabers. And my theory on why the game doesn't have beam sabers for those characters is because I think the developers are concerned it would homogenize the movesets too much. If every character that should have a beam saber had a beam saber, maybe it would make too many of the movesets too samey. And even though it's weird, I can definitely understand that philosophy, right? So if they are refraining from adding beam sabers, even if they are refraining from adding beam sabers, a beam saber has to eventually get put in the game, right? And so if a beam saber character is eventually going to get added into the game, what would be the perfect unit to save the beam sabers for, if you're not going to give it to the main RX-78-2 Gundam? And that's when it hit me. That's when I thought of the O from Zeta Gundam. You might be asking yourself, why would the O be the perfect beam saber character? That is because the O actually has a secret set of extra arms that can come out of its front armor skirts. Its front skirt armor. And so imagine being able to play as the O with 4 beam sabers, and from a first-person perspective, it would feel like you're General Grievous or something. So not only would that be super cool, but the O can use beam rifles as well. So it wouldn't be a pure melee character. It would have the option to use 4 beam sabers. Maybe you could switch between beam saber mode and ranged mode. So in one mode, you could hold all 4 beam sabers, but then in another mode, you pull out the beam rifle and you can use the rifle. But also, it can hold 4 beam rifles at once as well, because it has 4 arms. So maybe the ult could be holding all 4 beam rifles at the same time, and you just do this insta-barrage as the ult. So, like the Zogok, the O would be a hybrid between melee and ranged. Also, the O is a pretty big boy, so like the Sazabi, the O would probably be comparable in size. The Sazabi in the game is actually supposed to be way bigger than that, but they scaled it down to fit the rest of the roster, so I don't think the scale matters too much, but regardless, the O would probably end up being comparable in size to what the Sazabi got scaled down to. So that would be cool if we got another big character, because if you start adding more and more characters to the roster, it would be weird if Sazabi stayed as the big one. So anyways, let me know what you think about potentially playing as the O in Gundam Evolution. The O is probably the one I would be most excited for after Gundam X. So far, Gundam X, or Gundam X Divider specifically, and the O are the 2 I would like to see the most personally. Speaking of the Sazabi, next up would be the Sinanju, and the whole reason I'm suggesting the Sinanju is that we need a char suit that can actually kick opponents. So if you watched my tier list video, I mentioned my one gripe about the Sazabi in that its X-ray vision, its scanner ability should have been a kick instead. And so if they're not going to rework the Sazabi kit, they could literally just add the Sinanju into the game and put the kick on the Sinanju. But obviously, it would need to have more differences than just that. So in addition to having a kick, the Sinanju could use rocket launchers instead of a beam shotgun. So in addition to the Dom, the Sinanju would be the only other character with a rocket launcher in this case. Obviously, you'd want it to have different properties, but something more unique about the Sinanju's moveset is that in addition to the kick, and this would be sort of a reference to source material, but the Sinanju has these 2 fuel tanks attached to its back, so it can get to a part of the battlefield really fast by burning up all that fuel to propel itself really hard. But there's a part in the show in Gundam Unicorn in which the Sinanju detaches the fuel tanks and lets it drift in front of him, and then he shoots them, and it's a decoy explosion. So how cool would it be if not only this character had a melee kick, but you could also launch forward your fuel tanks, or maybe you could just drop your fuel tanks on the ground and then walk away from it, and then you could shoot the fuel tanks to create an explosion. So it would kind of be used like a grenade, or the GM's C4, but obviously you would have to actually shoot it yourself, so you're kind of setting a trap, right? I think that would be super cool, and again, this one's a little biased because I'm mostly just saying this because I want there to be a char suit that can kick opponents. And if I'm getting personal bias out of the way right now, I'm just going to say it. There should be at least one suit from Mobile Fighter G Gundam. I don't really care which one it is. Realistically speaking, it would probably either be God Gundam or Master Gundam. But again, I alluded to this early on. I would love to have like half the roster of G Gundam, but realistically speaking, all of the suits from G Gundam are going to be so wildly different from the rest of the roster in Gundam Evolution that really it would probably be the best idea if you only had like one, because if you had too many mobile suits running around punching and kicking everyone, that would be an entirely different game. A game that sounds cool, but I don't think that's what they're going for. So please, I just want one thing from G Gundam just so that way we can have that franchise represented. Like I said, it'll probably be Master Gundam or God Gundam. Either way, I think those would be great picks, and they would definitely be a wild card in the roster. And even though I'm trying to represent as many different Gundam series as possible on this list, there is one mobile suit I would like to see added whose series is already technically represented, but I think it is a popular enough series that it would make it excusable, and that is the Gujin Rebake Full City. So we already have Gundam Barbatos, but if they were going to add any other additional suit from Iron-Blooded Orphans, I think it would have to be Gujin Rebake Full City, and it is purely because of the giant scissors thing that it can use. So I imagine it would be similar to the Turn A Gundam's Judo Throw. You would activate it, it would have some sort of startup, and you would basically enter this stance with an active hitbox, and you would be automatically moving forward, and you would have to sort of aim, and if you come into contact with an enemy mobile suit, you would grab them with the scissors and then crush them. Maybe they could make it an ult instead of a regular ability, but the rest of its kit would revolve around live ammunition, and similar to the O, the Gujin Rebake Full City also has an additional set of arms, so that could be interesting. Next up is a mobile suit that I didn't initially think of, but I saw it requested a lot within the Gundam fandom after they got to play Gundam Evolution for themselves, mostly on Twitter and YouTube, right? So I don't know if this is necessarily representative of what most people want, but that is the Comfer from War in the Pocket, from 0080 War in the Pocket. And the reason why I initially didn't think the Comfer would be a good idea is because the Comfer uses a shotgun, But we already have the Sazabi, which has a shotgun, right? But upon further thought, even though they both have a shotgun, they would play completely differently, and they would have completely different game plans, right? So the Sazabi, even though it has a shotgun as well, the Sazabi is a wall. It's meant to be played defensively with the team, and it's a frontliner, right? And it uses the shotgun to burst opponents if they get close to him. The Kampfer, on the other hand, would play more hit and run, and you would use him to flank, and you would play him much more similar to the Zaku in the game, because the Zaku, you're supposed to flank with the Zaku. You would flank with the Kampfer as well, do a hit and run, hit them, use up your abilities, right, do your combo, and then get out of there. Because the Kampfer would be faster than the Sazabi, but it would also have a lot less armor. So not only would the Kampfer have a shotgun, but it would also have disposable missile launchers to help burst opponents, and also, probably most memorably, would be the Kampfer's magnetic mine whip. That sounds really weird, so if you haven't seen the show, let me describe it to you. The magnetic mine whip is basically a series of mines that are linked together with a cord, but they're magnetic. And so in the show, the Kampfer uses it like a whip to slap them onto the Gundam Alex, and it wraps around the Gundam Alex and sticks to the Alex, obviously because the mines are magnetic and the Alex is made of metal, and it blows up all the armor on the outside of the Alex, revealing the Alex underneath. I was talking about the Alex earlier. So I think if the Kampfer were to get added, it would decrease the chances of the Alex getting added to the game. Not that the Alex had a high chance of getting added anyway, but I think adding the Kampfer would basically essentially deconfirm the Alex for good, because I don't think War in the Pocket is big enough or popular enough to merit adding 2 suits from the show or the OVA series. But the Kampfer would definitely be cool, and that magnetic mine whip would be pretty interesting, and I think that ability alone merits adding the Kampfer into the game. So if they do add the Kampfer, and they also wanted to still add a Diva archetype instead of the Alex, I think they would do something like the Penelope, or maybe Gundam Virtue from 00. But let me know what you guys think. Let me know if you would want the Kampfer added. Next up is something I'm mentioning because it's an absolute classic, and that is the Zeong. And if you don't know about the Zeong, basically it is a Mega Zoner Supreme. So it can shoot out a beam from each of its fingertips, and obviously it can shoot beams, multiple beams at the same time in different directions. And not only that, but it's able to shoot out its fists and then have the fists shoot out the beams after they've reached a certain distance. So it can shoot you from all these multiple directions at the same time. It can get surprise attacks that way. And also, it could have a very interesting ult if it were a utility ult. And the reason I'm saying this is because it's an opportunity to reference the source material. So instead of it having an attack as its ult, what if it activates a passive ability? And that passive ability basically gives you a second life, an extra life. So when your HP reaches 0, when you should normally blow up and you would be forced to respawn, what if instead of that happening, if your ult is ready and off cooldown, the head detaches and then you're able to fly around as the head? Because that's what happens in the show. The cockpit is in the head, and Char, when piloting the Zeong at the end of the original Gundam, he's able to detach the head when most of the Zeong is destroyed, and then he's able to fly around that way as basically an extra life. So that would be really cool, and it would also be really hard to hit the head flying around since it would be a very small hitbox. So that sounds goofy, but really, I think it's only a matter of time until they add some kind of utility ult, and not only would it just be a creative use of the ult, I don't really know what else they could add as an ult, because he's just beam guy. He just shoots beams, and that's his whole gimmick. So he'd be Mega Zoner Supreme with a utility ult. Next up is a mobile suit I am mostly mentioning for the sake of adding visual variety to the roster, but it would also serve as a rep for F91, and it would also have a unique moveset in its own right, and that is the Burga Gyros, if I am pronouncing that correctly. So not only does the Burga Gyros look really cool and unique, and also it's purple, but in addition to its machine guns, it can shoot lances, and also in addition to the lances, it gets a beam shield like the Crossbone Gundam, and most interestingly, this isn't something that the Burga Gyros specifically uses from the mobile suit itself, but it is from F91, and it is included as part of the Burga Gyros' moveset in Gundam Versus, so that's partly what I'm basing this on. But there are these things in Gundam F91 called bugs. Don't ask me why they're called bugs, but they're basically these flying Beyblades that can seek out humans and attack them. So in Gundam Versus, the Burga Gyros can shoot out the bugs, and so if the Burga Gyros could do that in Gundam Evolution, that would be something entirely unique to him in the game, and maybe you could give the opponents an opportunity to shoot down the bugs before they hit said enemies, and that would actually be a scary thing to deal with. So I think that would be a very unique and interesting mobile suit to add into the game. So now, if I have been counting correctly, we are on number 15, And even though I was putting this in no particular order, I specifically wanted to save this one for last because it's kind of a joke character, but also not, and it's also very open-ended. And that would be an SD Gundam, which sounds ridiculous, but if you think about it, that would be the perfect joke character in the game. Because at first I was thinking of adding a ball as a joke character, because that would be really fun. But really, there's no way to add a ball into the game as a joke character while also making it viable, right? Because the ball just wouldn't be able to do anything aside from maybe shooting out a grappling hook and shooting, but that's pretty much all it would do. But an SD Gundam, on the other hand, could be any of the SD Gundams, and you could make a really cool moveset. So I'm thinking specifically maybe the Knight Gundam, or maybe one of those SD Musha Gundams, and it would also just add so much more variety to the roster if you have this chibi-looking Gundam with pupils and irises on its eyes, because the SD Gundams are actually fully autonomous, sentient robots that can operate themselves instead of having to be piloted. So that is my list. Let me know if I missed any mobile suits that you think should be added into the game. Let me know your predictions about the final roster that the game will have on launch. And also, I just want to point out some honorable mentions, mobile suits that I think would be cool, but just wouldn't work in the game for one reason or another. First up, the Gyan. The Gyan would be really cool because it can shoot missiles out from its shield, but aside from shooting missiles out of its shield and attacking with its sword, I don't really know what else it could do. Also, the Gelgoog would be cool because the Gelgoog has this twin-sided beam saber that it can spin around, but aside from that, I don't know what else it could do. Also, the Thunderbolt suits are all really cool. I kind of want Thunderbolt to be represented, but the more you think about it, all the suits in Thunderbolt are just covered with these vernier thrusters, and they're all pretty much meant to be used in space, not on the ground. So if Thunderbolt does get represented, maybe they could use the At guys from Bandit Flower. And so if you add an At guy instead of the Zogok that I was mentioning, maybe the At guy from Thunderbolt could not only serve as a rep from Thunderbolt, or a rep for Thunderbolt, but it could also just serve the role of the aquatic mobile suit. Also, the Cubely. The Cubely is super recognizable and is such a classic design, but I don't know what else the Cubely could do besides funnels and beam sabers, because that's really all it does. Also, its shoulders are so wide, I don't know how it could fit through the doors. So anyways, let me know what you guys think, and with all that said, I will see you later, so bye for now.